Howdy, Jack Wheeler again, and we're going to pick up where we left off with that childhood fantasy that ended up becoming what the press called the Reagan Doctrine. Remember, we didn't call it the Reagan Doctrine. That's what the press ended up calling the Reagan Doctrine when they figured out what we were doing a couple of years later. We call it FTC. That was our name for it. But at any rate, all these friends of mine that were in Youth for Reagan with me in 1965 are in the White House. One of them in particular was a fellow named Dana Rohrabacher. Dana has since 1988, and the end of the Reagan administration, has been a United States congressman from California, but at the time he was special assistant to the president and speechwriter for President Reagan. And I'm in my place in Malibu, because I sure don't want to live in Washington, D.C. I'm in my place in Malibu, and I have this little apartment. I was lucky enough to get it with a beautiful ocean view. And Dana and I are talking, and I'm sitting in my chair talking to him, and I'm looking at this map, because I've had this map for a long, long time, with all the lines I've drawn, where I've been. And I say, hey Dana, you know that map in my room, my study, you know, with all the lines on it? I said, yeah. I said, well, the map really looks different to me. He says, what do you mean? I said, well, I mean, it really looks different. I mean, I'm seeing anti-Soviet rebellions all over the world. And he said, what? And I said, yeah, I mean, you know, it's something's going on in Nicaragua, right? Because you guys are helping that. And we know that there are these freedom fighters, or these people in Afghanistan fighting the Soviets because they've invaded Afghanistan. And there's something going on in Angola, and there's something going on in Mozambique. I don't know what, but I've heard stuff. And it just, something tells me that, like in the 60s and 70s, there were all these communist liberation movements that were fighting to turn pro-Western countries or Western colonies into Soviet colonies. Now it's reversed. Now there are anti-Soviet rebellions, anti-communist rebellions. They want to turn communist countries back to freedom. That's what they want. And he said, you're kidding. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, Jack, that's really very interesting, but how are you going to prove it? I mean, nobody here at the White House that I know of is talking about this. I said, well, okay, yeah, you know, I'll be right back. So I got out in the world, raised some money through the Reason Foundation, as a matter of fact, and I got out in the world and I spent 6 months talking my way into these anti-Soviet insurgencies. So I end up in northern Pakistan, trying to get in touch with one guy who speaks English with the main group of Afghan freedom fighters, or Mujahideen. The group is called Jamiat. This guy's name is Abdul Rahim, and I find out he's in this caravanserai way up in the Hindu Kush called Chitral. And so I get up to Chitral, and I ask to see him, and he comes out of this like fortress up on this cliff above a river. And he says, I'm Abdul Rahim, who are you? And I said, I'm Jack Wheeler. I'm nobody. He doesn't know anybody. I certainly can't say I'm with the White House. I'm not with the New York Times. I'm nobody. And he says, so we walk over to the bluff, overlooking this river, the Chitral River, and right up there is Tirik Mir, the highest mountain in the Hindu Kush, 25,000 feet high. An incredible scene. And he says, what do you want? What are you doing? And I say, well, I'm studying people who are fighting the Soviets all over the world. And he said, what? What? And I said, yes, well, Afghanistan has been invaded by the Soviet Union. And you're fighting to get your freedom back from the Soviet Union. And he said, yes, that's what we're doing. I said, well, this is not the only place. The Soviet Union has an empire And it has lots of colonies, just not one like Afghanistan. And in many of these places, like Nicaragua and Angola and Mozambique, of course you never even heard of these countries, they're fighting the same fight you are. And I'm studying people like you who are fighting the Soviets in different places, in different Soviet colonies all over the world. And he was blown away. He never heard anything like this in his life. And he said, "You're kidding." And I said, no, it's actually happening. And all of a sudden, I'm interesting. I'm interesting to him. I know something, and I'm doing something that he really wants to know about. And so he said, "Well, let's talk. Wow, what can we do? How can I help you?" And he wants to help me now. And so, and I went. And I went in like 3 times, just that one time. And I went into Angola with Savimbi, and Mozambique, and Nicaragua with the Contras. And I spent 6 months doing this. And I got back to the White House, and we had this meeting, and there were people. It was in the West Wing, the OEOB of the White House. And there were people from the West Wing and CIA and National Security Council and all this stuff. And I showed them all these pictures that I took, and I said, "It's really happening." And it was the pictures that did it. They saw these people. They were real people, and they were really fighting, and they were fighting the same fight to get rid of the Soviet Union. I said, it's not just to give freedom to Nicaragua, as good as that could be, or Afghanistan, but if we support the entire phenomenon of resistance to Soviet imperialism, we can make a structural assault on the structure of the Soviet empire. And the goal should be to bust the empire, for it to cease being a colonial power, to bust the entire empire. And if we support the whole phenomenon, it's too much for the Soviets to fight them all off at one time. My childhood fantasy, when I was 13 years old, came true in that meeting. And that meeting, everybody who was at that meeting says that was the birth of what the press called the Reagan Doctrine. It was in November of 1983. So you have childhood fantasies and dreams when you're a kid. Don't give them up. Don't give them up. Remember them. And maybe someday they'll come true. Like, with good fortune, mine came true as well. Thanks.